Welcome, everybody, to the American Space Museum. I'm Mark Marquette, and we're so glad you're with us today to stay curious. Today with Mr. Nick Thomas. We call him the Astronaut Wrangler out of Kennedy Space Center Visitors Complex. Nix, how are you there?
See you, Mark. How you
Good
been?
to see you. We've been great. We've Marty Winkle, as you know, is manning the boards there. Say hi to Marty. Marty, how you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
Real fine.
I'm doing good. Nick was on vacation when we were out there getting some autographs with Mike Baker this week, so we're glad you're all refreshed. But Nick comes on our Stay Curious program once a month and talks about some of the shuttles, Apollo, Gemini, or Mercury missions with the astronauts that he knows of. And today we're going to feature the one and only Wally Schirra.
Yeah.
Everything we love about Wally, one of my favorites. I had his picture on the wall as a kid up there with my heroes.
Seeing as how everyone is so eager to claim days and months, I'm hereby declaring October to be Wally Schirra month.
That's
Because
right.
he flew two of his three missions during this month, and they were highly successful and very important missions we'll talk about today.
And you know, Wally Schirra, everyone, you say that name, you have to put astronaut in front of that, do you?
No, you don't.
No, you don't. And these are our Mercury 7 heroes that Nick and I grew up with. Nick, tell us where you grew up and how you got into this business just a little bit.
Well, I grew up in Daytona Beach, about 50 miles up the road from here. And in May of 1961, I was 5 years old. Watched the launch of Alan Shepard on TV, and then ran out in the backyard and watched as it crossed through the contrail layer and let off that long stream of smoke. And from then I was hooked. And at that time the nuns at school realized that I wasn't going to be in school on launch day. But I understood that when I came back the next day, I had to stand in front of the class. I had to describe the launch, I had to explain the mission, and I had to answer at least three questions. So that's how the whole thing got started.
That's interesting. Put a public speaker right at the beginning, and if you've ever seen Nick at Kennedy Space Center, you know he does a great job with the astronauts. They do more than just those astronaut encounters you might see for free. We're going to do a program about that one day, about it's a 9 to 5 that you got these astronauts out there.
Yeah. It's you got about 15 minutes between events, so you got enough time to catch your breath and relax. But then it's on to the next thing, and it's a good pace because it makes the day go by faster.
Well, it's a wonderful thing Delaware North does, I think, public access to astronauts and some behind-the-scenes activities out there. Who you have out there this week, Nick?
Wendy Lawrence is starting with us today, as a matter of fact. And Wendy, of course, is a veteran of the shuttle program. Her last flight, STS-114, was the first shuttle flight to follow the loss of the Columbia. But beyond that, Wendy is a naval aviator, helicopter pilot, and she told me a great story about how she bagged a submarine in a helicopter one time. I'll tell you about that.
That'd be great.
But,
We'll have to have a Wendy Lawrence or feature
Yeah.
2 or 3 of these astronauts that you've gotten to
Absolutely.
know well, because
Absolutely.
they come back. There's a cycle to some of them that come every quarter, a few of them, but a few of them want to come at least once or twice a year and experience wonderful Florida and get a little love from the people that really appreciate them.
It's a good way to reconnect with the program, and all the men and women in the office really enjoy coming back and, as I say, reconnecting with the program that way.
Then we got a special lady coming after Wendy.
Yeah, Julie Payette from the Canadian Space Agency. She's been with us once before. I assisted her on her orientation, but then regretfully on the day that she was to start, I fell ill and I didn't get to work with her. So I am looking forward to working with her this time, because we've had nothing but great comments from public and from fellow workers about Julie and her presentations, and just her as a person.
Yeah, she really impressed everybody. That was last July here for the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation, too. We got Wendy Lawrence and Julie Payette out at the Space Center this weekend to get into the holiday spirit of everything.
And people forget that Julie, for a while, was also the second most important Canadian official in the Canadian government.
Yes.
She was a direct representative of the Queen.
All right.
So very heady, very important position.
And also she's a opera singer.
Oh, no, I
She
didn't know
sang.
that.
She sang with the Toronto, all these opera companies and
Oh,
so forth.
okay.
And she speaks like 6 languages, Nick.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Jeez.
So we're going to be out there all over
Amazing.
Julie Payette. We'll show some pictures as we love promoting the Kenny's Visitors Complex out there and things they do. And let's turn Nick loose here. We appreciate that Nick has been
Resequence.
we got to rack up the pictures there a little bit. Marty, what we pick behind us here? What Marty picked for a green screen there, Nick?
That is the launch of Apollo 7 from about 2 miles away from Pad 34. Today people are restricted to 4 miles away from the Complex 39 pads, but Saturn 1B, smaller vehicle, closer reach, so you're about 2 miles away from Pad 34 there.
That still had to be a very great sight to see those hypergolic fuels go
Well,
off there.
Absolutely breathtaking, and the idea that we were bringing the Apollo program back from the fire, that was a very special day.
You talked about being a young man, a kid, seeing the launches there. And I know you had some aspirations of the theater and so forth. And we're in New York City, we talked about. So you missed the Gemini? Were you? No, you were.
No, it's not for the
you were
Gemini.
there in the '80s.
I was
Did you
in
see
New
many
York during the
Gemini launches?
Well, the Gemini launches I saw, but again, just like the Redstone, the Gemini hypergols burned very clean, and you really couldn't see the rocket from Daytona Beach until it hit the condensation layer.
Gotcha.
The first live launch I saw from across the river in Titusville, that would have been Apollo 8. And from then on, my father brought me to Titusville to watch all of the Apollo launches, all the Saturn V launches.
Lucky guy you are, that's for sure. Marty saw them all too, but
Yeah.
he was working with
He was
Grumman.
working.
Yeah. He was sitting there going, all right, that's done. Now let's go back to work and put another moon ship together. As, of course, my co-producer, Marty Winkle, worked for Grumman that built the lunar module, and we always proudly love calling him a national treasure that
And
these
worked
people
on
are.
the shuttle main engines as
Then he
well.
worked on the shuttle main engines, LPS program. So, today he's running our Streamlabs program with me, and about 916th episode today, I think, Marty. So, well, let's shut up, Mark, and let's listen to Nick talk about this wonderful astronaut, everybody's favorite.
Well, here we see
very
Walt-
smart guy. His glib manners and stuff, I think, deflected how intelligent this guy really was.
Well, it was easy to figure Wally as being a good-natured, practical joker, but he was a very serious engineer and test pilot. He came from a great heritage. He was not only a naval aviator, but a test pilot. He was a fighter pilot in Korea. He scragged 2 MiGs when he was in Korea, so he had a good combat record. And he brought to the program the focus and the intensity of the engineering test pilot. But again, I wouldn't say he masked that with his joviality. His joviality was simply another part of his nature. Another part of his nature came out during the Apollo program, which we'll talk about later on. But here's Wally over on the second deck of Hangar S, being suited up, getting ready for that 6-orbit Mercury flight. Now, Wally came to this flight in a very circuitous fashion. John Glenn flew successfully in February of 1962, and John was scheduled to be followed by Deke Slayton, and Deke was going to fly another 3-orbit flight on board his capsule that he was going to name Delta 7. Unfortunately, he was grounded because of his heart problem, so Wally was Deke's backup. And after Deke was grounded, Wally's immediate and logical assumption was, it's my flight. But then they told him, they said, no, Scott Carpenter's going to take this flight, and you're going to fly as backup again. And Wally described that, frankly, as being another shot in the rear end. Because, number one, he was disappointed that he hadn't been selected for the very first Mercury flight that was taken by Alan Shepard. And now he was having a flight essentially taken away from him, and he was being slipped into the backup role. So he was understandably distressed by this. But Chris Kraft and I believe Walt Williams took him aside and said, look, just hold your mud, just relax. We've got something important for you. You're going to be a part of something bigger and better. Well, after Scott's mission came back, after all of its difficulties and empty fuel tanks during reentry, that's when Chris Kraft and the Mercury team realized the next flight had to prove that the human was absolutely responsible in the loop. And we needed an engineering test flight. And for that flight, we needed an honest-to-God flight experienced test pilot. So Wally was selected for that flight. And immediately he and Chris Kraft set about paring down the flight plan, taking all hints of science out of it and concentrating specifically on testing the spacecraft and how to operate properly up in orbit. Here we are coming out of Hangar S, heading out to the big, what the boys back in those days called it the cattle car, because it's basically a semi-truck. And I don't know who's with him. I'm sure.
Yeah, look at the background, guys.
I think Bill Douglas had left the program this time, so I don't know who our chief medical officer was at that time. But nevertheless, this is Wally coming out of the big doors at Hangar S and heading over to the transport van, which we'll see him getting out of here at the pad. And that's Gordon Cooper in the lead. Gordo was Wally's backup pilot. And this is out at pad 14, getting out of the van and heading up the tower to be inserted into the capsule. Here we are, capsule insertion up in the white room. Gordo, you can see there without the hat, and Wally with a slight smile on his face, being gently placed into Sigma 7 for that long wait on the launch pad until launch. As I say, this flight plan had been pared down to its bare essentials. We were going to concentrate on the spacecraft, on its proper operation, and the proper place of the man in the loop during this flight.
Make a comment about the insignia there for the...
Yeah, down below under the window, that symbol that looks like an E is actually the letter for Sigma in the Greek alphabet, I believe, and Sigma being the reference to the summation of. So basically, Wally is saying with Sigma 7 that this is going to be the summation of everything we can learn from an engineering test flight. As I say, a highly technical view of the spacecraft and its proper operation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the problems with both John Glenn's and Scott Carpenter's flight was that John came home with nearly empty fuel tanks, and Scott's vehicle ran out of fuel during the reentry. So that was the big cause celeb that people were saying, well, maybe this program won't work. And Chris Kraft and Walt Williams and those people realized that we had to have a mission centered primarily on the vehicle and the astronaut's ability to control all aspects of the vehicle, including fuel usage. So this was going to be a big thing. Pilots will talk about fuel margins, and pilots live and die by fuel margins. And it's a matter of pride to come home with the most fuel in your tanks. So that was going to be one of Wally's primary concerns during this flight. You had the two fuel systems of automatic and manual, but you had several systems of manual control that would affect your fuel usage, and we'll talk about that a little bit.
People, as we watch the launch here, Nick, this is 1963.
62.
62. The world is a lot different than it is today, of course. Hard to wrap your head around for other people what was going on. This was so important. Americans, Joe and Jane America out there knew very little about the nuts and bolts of this thing.
Sure.
And here we had putting another man for the third time to orbit the Earth. I'm just trying to get the excitement here. This was a big deal back then.
Absolutely. And another unknown point of history that was going on at this time was we had just discovered the placement of Soviet missiles 90 miles off our shore in Cuba. So that's going to play into our story a little later on at the conclusion of the flight.
Take it. I'm trying to build up the drama for this. It was just not like a SpaceX launch that we're so accustomed to now.
Everything was new. Everything was for the first time. We were learning from step one. These were baby steps. We were writing the book as we went along. And Sigma 7 was such an important part of that process. Now, I think we've got a picture of South America. If you can just barely see it under the clouds. This is from Wally's window. One of the things they did on this flight, this was the first flight to utilize a Hasselblad camera, 70 millimeter Hasselblad, known for its clarity and for its sharp pictures. So I believe this is one of the pictures taken from the Hasselblad. Now, we were talking about fuel usage on this flight. one of the first things that happened in a Mercury flight after the vehicle separated from the booster was the vehicle would be in what we called ASCS, Automatic Stabilization Control System. And this was an autopilot that would first stabilize the capsule from any rates it may have incurred from the separation. And then it would turn the capsule around 180 degrees and put it into what was called orbit attitude. Now, the normal way to do this was to leave the vehicle in automatic and let the automatic system make this maneuver, and it could turn the capsule around 180 degrees in about 30 seconds. The problem was it used the high thrusters and hosed out a lot of propellant. And so what Wally did was, after he separated from the vehicle, or from the booster, and the vehicle was stabilized, Wally switched over to a mode called fly-by-wire. And he made small inputs into the control system, what Wally called micro mouse farts. And he turned doing this, and I was able to perform this in a Mercury simulator and saw that it did work. You use the fly-by-wire system and you put out a couple of pulses, and that would turn the capsule around properly, but it would take around 2 minutes, 15 seconds for it to get into position. But, you know, who's worried about time? Wally figures it's all about the fuel consumption. So he gets the vehicle into orbit attitude, pitch down 34 degrees, nose down, and he starts the mission. Now, a lot of the flight would be spent in what was drifting flight, which was simply to let go of the control system and let the capsule drift into any attitude orientation that it would. Wally felt no discomfort. He felt no disorientation. He said he was very he said drifting, and he said, I think drifting and dreaming would be apropos at this point. But again, this was another way of controlling or conserving fuel on the spacecraft. I think the one problem, I won't call it a problem, but somewhere over South America, one of the comtechs, who was not supposed to speak to the astronaut, comtech told Wally he was passing over South America and said, do you have anything to say to our people down here? Guaymas, Mexico, that's where it was. So Wally was kind of, yeah, he wasn't happy about this because he was in the process of performing some work on the capsule. And he just said, well, buenos dias, you all. And that went down as a big headline.
Yeah.
But again, Wally was primarily concerned with the capsule rather than what you refer to as public relations. And coming back home, this, I believe this was the first splashdown we ever caught on camera. That's how close Wally came to the Kearsarge. But you see the capsule coming down much the same way as our SpaceX capsules do now. You hit the water at probably about 25 to 30 miles per hour. It's a good jolt. But Wally called for a pickup rather than a helicopter pickup. He called for the helicopter to, or the Kearsarge to come by and then lift the capsule onto the deck, and he would get out of the capsule at that time. And here we are, egressing from the capsule after 6 orbits around the Earth. And when Wally finished his mission just before retrofire and reentry, he had 80% manual and 80% automatic fuel in his system. I mean, just hit it out of the ballpark. The thing that Wally didn't like was the flight plan said, okay, we're going to use ASCS to do the retrofire and the reentry. And Wally said, oh, there goes a big chunk of all the fuel. I say, but he had the record. There was no problem there. So here he is getting out of the capsule on board the Kearsarge. As I mentioned earlier, we were unknowingly in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis at this time. And a couple of days later, Wally went to the White House to meet with President Kennedy. Wally brought his family with him. Now, Wally at the time had a very precocious and very intelligent daughter named Suzanne. And Suzanne was with him there at the White House, and they're looking around, talking to President Kennedy, and Suzanne's kind of furtive, looking around like she's expecting something, and finally she tugs on her dad's wrist sleeve, and he bends down, and she says, "Daddy, where's the monkey?" So, you know, out of the mouths of babes. I remember there was a great picture of Suzanne when the Life magazine guys were at Wally's house to talk to him, and Suzanne's coming out of the other room shushing the reporters because her dollies were inside taking a nap.
Oh, that's cute.
So this is the successful end of Sigma 7. Again, a very important flight.
9 hours of data, learning this
Yeah.
whole system.
Yep.
A big part of this mission too was the ground control communication that they were establishing. Every mission they would get more, but they had boats at sea and
Problem solving we had the Wally suit overheated, and it was the same problem that Scott Carpenter had. But Wally found out that what you needed to do was to inch the cooling control down in small notches, a little bit at a time, so you didn't freeze the system. And that's something, if anybody is ever involved with air conditioning in their car or their home, that's the thing. You bring the temperature down gradually so you don't freeze the system out.
And where's this spaceship at now, Sigma 7?
That's a good question. I don't know where that is now. I'd have to look that up.
It's out at Kennedy Visitors Complex.
Oh, excuse me, of course.
Yes,
What's wrong with
they
it?
have it bastardized against the
Well,
redstone.
it's
and
tucked up against that redstone,
Yeah.
and people seldom see it, and if they see it, they don't realize.
at the Astronaut Hall of Fame building.
I personally think, we put the LEM back down on the ground.
Yes,
7.5. We ought to do the same.
I
with
was looking at that
Sigma 7.
the other day.
Put her in that pedestal where she's sitting down on the ground, where people can look in the hatch and.
I
look at
love
the
that place,
spacecraft.
but there's a lot of wasted space now. That's some of those cubicle things of the They got a lot of astronaut memorabilia there. Their flight helmets or their jets and
Well, I
stuff
wouldn't
like
say
that.
it's wasted space, but it could be used differently,
Yeah, I'd like
perhaps.
that. They've got
Sure.
Gemini 9s out there.
Gemini's out there, right?
And a cool thing. But yeah, that's out there at the visitors complex there. So great mission.
Yeah.
Wally did it right. I mean, everybody gave him A+ on everything.
Yeah.
And he was probably snickering there.
He
a
was
little bit.
fast tracked into the first rendezvous mission
Absolutely.
for Gemini, so we knew that was going to work out well. Of course, in 1968, Wally flew as a commander of Apollo 7 with Don Isley and Walt Cunningham. And again, this is a matter of a long way around the barn to get to this assignment. Now, in 1966, Gus, Roger, and Ed were scheduled as the Apollo 1 crew. Apollo 2, that was going to be another flight of the Block 1 spacecraft, was manned by Wally, Walt, and Don. Now, a lot of people inside the agency, particularly I get so much of this from Walt Cunningham, realized that Apollo 2 was just going to be redundant. It was going to be another flight of the Block 1. We were trying to get to the Block 2s. And on top of that, Gus Grissom, who didn't even like the smell of anything scientific, he was taking all the scientific experiments off Apollo 1, dumping them onto Apollo 2, and Wally took it without a complaint. Wally didn't like science any more than Gus did. But what we found out later, according to Walt Cunningham, was that Deke Slayton was trying to get himself medically reinstated. And if he was able to, he was going to take command of Apollo 2. Well, it didn't happen, so here's Wally. He's stuck with two rookies on a mission loaded with science that's simply going to be a number of days in Earth orbit going round and round and round. So Wally got a little bit restless at that. Subsequently, there was a contractor conference held in Miami Beach. And one day, Wally and his crew, and I think his backup crew, were sitting around the pool talking about the things that they didn't like about the Block 1 spacecraft. And there were a lot of things that people didn't like about those. So they drew up a list of, I think, about 10 items about the things that needed to be fixed on the spacecraft. And Wally said he was going to send it up the chain in a memo. Unfortunately, Wally sent that memo up with basically the proviso said, either these things get fixed or we won't fly. So the memo goes up the line. In November of 1966, Wally, Walt, and Don are in the viewing room at Mission Control. They're watching the splashdown of Gemini 12. And Paul Haney from Public Affairs comes in, and he hands Wally a memo. And he says, Wally, would you initial this memo before we release it? So Wally reads the memo, and his face flushes red with anger. He scribbles his initials on it, gives it back to Haney, and storms out of the room. So Walt and Don follow him out the hall, and what's the problem? He said, they've canceled Apollo 2. We're now back up to Apollo 1. And Walt said later on that, deep down we all realized that Apollo 2 was redundant. It was useless just as well that we scrapped it. But Walt said, on the other hand, we didn't need Wally pounding nails into our coffin. So Wally and his crew are now the backups for Apollo 1. And then, of course, after the fire, Wally and his crew are promoted for the next manned flight of Apollo. And I think that's where the next picture will take us.
Why we jumped from 2 to 7? And quickly say Block 1 and Block 2
Yeah, well,
differences in them.
yeah, a long story about the enumeration of these flights. Apollos 1 and 2 were, for some reason or other, stricken from the books. Apollo 3 was the first unmanned flight. Let me see. No, excuse me. 2 and 3 were taken off the books. Apollo 4 was the first unmanned flight of Saturn V. Apollo 5 was a Saturn 1B carrying a unmanned lunar module into Earth orbit. And then Apollo 6 was the second unmanned flight of the Saturn V rocket.
Okay, so just 2 and 3 just never existed
Yeah,
anymore.
I don't think they're on the books.
Good. Okay, well, here's the crew.
Here's the crew inside the command module in the White Room. And Wally, of course, again, he's not only focused on this being an engineering test flight, but he's also very angry with all the things that were allowed to fall through the cracks leading up to Apollo 1. Now, I think Gene Kranz, among others, will tell you that Apollo 1 was on everybody. It was on flight controllers, it was on mission managers, and it was on astronauts, because the astronauts, too, had the idea that, well, we can fly the crates they came in. Or, we'll fix that as we get down the line. We'll get that fixed before launch. And everyone was gung-ho, pressured, of course, by President Kennedy's schedule, getting a man on the moon before the end of the decade. So it comes down to the fact that Wally was very angry, and he was very focused on making this a good flight. And on one instance, he was at the plant in Downey, California, where they built Command Module. His spacecraft, 101, was in the test stand. They hadn't put the couches in it yet. Well, Wally's in this bunny suit. He's going to go inside and inspect the spacecraft. Well, he steps inside and he puts his foot down on a wire bundle. And there was an engineer, a technician inside the spacecraft who yelled at him to get the hell out of the spacecraft. So Wally went down the steps and went over to the test conductor stand. And he said, "Who's that guy working on 101? And the test conductor told him. And Wally said, "I want him to get accommodation because that's the kind of guy I want working on my spacecraft." So Wally's fault, if any, was his intense desire for everything to go right. You had two approaches here. You had Wally and you had Frank Borman. Frank Borman, who was just as intensely focused on perfection, or as close to perfection as possible, but the kind of guy to let the other guy get his job done. And in fact, some of the guys at North American called Frank and asked them, would you call Wally off? He really kind of bearing down on our guys here. But again, Wally was simply focused on getting a safe spacecraft and having a successful mission. Now, a lot of us know about what we call the praying hands picture of Apollo 1. It's a crew were assembled around the Apollo 1 capsule model. Wally staged the same thing during the same photo session, and I expect Wally did this purposely as a reminder to everybody how Gus and the crew felt about the need for professionalism, getting everything right. And this is kind of a stark reminder, and this didn't really set Wally well among many of the managers. He originally wanted to call his spacecraft the Phoenix, the bird that rises from its own ashes and flies. But they said, no, you're not going to do that. But Wally was very intent about reminding everyone, from managers to technicians to fellow astronauts, what we had just come through and what was at stake. And it was the entire manned space program at stake in this mission. That's why Wally is one of those right people at the right time. He's one of our recovery commanders. There's Wally, there's Rick Houck, and there's Eileen Collins, who have all flown missions after disasters and made them work. So Wally gets the highest respect I have from this flight.
We're talking with Nick Thomas, who is Space Geeks out there working without notes, talking about some of the experiences he's had with some of these astronauts. It's quite fascinating. And many of you are seeing this picture like me for the first time. I never knew this picture existed there, Nick. So let's continue on here with Mr. Wally Schirra.
Here's the life cover well after the fire. And if you look in the caption, you can see it just below to the right of Wally. It says, Wally Schirra, commander of Apollo 2, because that's what everyone was thinking of the next mission as being. It wasn't until later that was designated as Apollo 7. But again, Wally felt the extreme responsibility of getting this right, not only for the agency, but for the country. This was important for the country as well. And Wally Schirra, as anyone will tell you, was not your average walking through the passenger liner, Captain, how was your meal tonight? Are you comfortable? And that's
Yeah.
what Wally was, the captain of his ship, first, last, and always. And as I say, he pointed this laser-like focus at everything he did in this spacecraft. A lot of people will tell you that, what happened to the old Jolly Wally? I said, well, it's because he's damn mad right now, and he's got a lot on his shoulders, and I would think he would be forgiven for just about anything during this time, because he did have a weight of the world on his shoulders. But one of the things he did during this run-up to Apollo 7 was he had announced his retirement. He said, this is going to be my last flight. He says, this business consumes people, and I have been consumed. So actually, that was a very smart thing to do, because what are you going to do with a guy who's already retired?
Yeah.
What can you basically threaten him with?
Who had 2 stellar missions.
Exactly.
We'll talk about Gemini
So
2 in just a minute.
A lot of people mentioned how this really played into his later behavior during the mission.
Those of you under maybe 40 years old don't know about Life magazine. This is a viral. You talk about the viral social media. Yeah. Being on the cover of Life magazine was, or Time or Newsweek, was viral in those days. So everybody knew who this man was.
Life magazine was before TikTok.
Yeah, exactly. Before TikTok. That's your X or whatever they call it now on there. But
now this is Wally and Walt and Don. They're in the training room over at KSC, Flight Crew Training Building. And you see the steps in the background that leads up to the command module simulator. And I love this picture because it's typical Wally. He's got his coffee in his hand. He's going to tell a few stories and chat with the guys. And occasionally, I think Walt said that Wally would sometimes be in the mind of, well, I'm going to go get some coffee. Call me when it's fixed. So, but of
course, later you got Walt there. We haven't talked much about Don Isley there.
Don Isley, who was the command module pilot, who made the famous quote during a press conference. He said, I'm the navigator. I've got a right to know where we are. But,
lost to cancer a decade or so ago.
I think he was in Tokyo when he passed away, if I'm not mistaken. But really, 3 remarkable men, again, feeling the weight every bit as much as Wally did. Here's Deke talking to the guys over at the O&C building up on the, I think this will be up on the 3rd or 4th floor, and basically having a laugh and talking about the flight and what's going to happen. As you can see, between Wally and Deke, it's always going to be a relaxed atmosphere. Everybody's going to be hanging out and so forth. But when the time comes to bear down, to buckle down, you had 2 people there, and Deke Slayton and Wally Schirra, who were absolutely focused in whatever they were doing from a technical standpoint. Here's Walt and Wally at another meeting, again chatting things up. Wally with his omnipresent coffee, and just a very, for all the pressure, they could be a very relaxed crew. And Wally was always an advocate of what he called maintaining an even strain. Not too hard, not too soft, but just right.
Mm-hmm. I always like to say that Cunningham had the best flat top of all the astronauts' haircut.
Oh yeah. He had a raise. He could that haircut could cut glass. I think. Yeah.
He passed away about 2 years ago. We lost Wally about 12 years ago, I believe.
And Walt, we spent a lot of time with at the visitors complex. He worked with us for
he was a regular out there, wasn't he?
Back when we were doing the show outside.
Oh.
And the thing about Walt was we had a run up to the stage. It was probably about 15, 20 feet.
I'm not familiar with that. We mean outside.
Outside, outdoors.
Really?
That, where the rotating capsule is? That's where we used to be.
Oh, really? Okay.
So anyway, we had about a 15, 20-foot run up the center aisle to the stage itself. And the stage was elevated perhaps 3.5 feet or so, 3.5 feet off the ground. And we had a ramp that we would go up around and get on the surface of the stage and start the show. Well, Walt was a former gymnast. And Walt would take that running jump from 15 feet back, and he would jump on that stage every time we did a show.
Wow.
And he invited me to do that one time. I said, there's no way in heaven you're going to get me to do that.
That would be fun to see out there at KSC.
Yeah, he made a signature entrance. These are the guys, again, during a training session up out at pad 34. By the clothing, certainly wasn't a pressurized test. It may have been a systems and communications test they were running at the time.
Unusual photograph there. Like you said, I've never seen that outfits on astronauts before. Looks like a lot of, is that yellow, a lot of Velcro or? Huh.
I don't know. Again, that's the
pressure stuff
first
on it.
time. Now here we are on.
Yeah, Marty,
Go ahead,
got a
Martin.
question?
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, those yellow straps were to pull the astronauts out of the cabin if they needed to.
Oh yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Grab them by the straps and pull them out.
There you go. A safety thing there. Thank you, Marty.
Here we are on launch day out at the ONC building, Wally getting suited up. For those of us watching the program at the time, we were all used to those Gemini suits with the helmet and the visor and so forth. This was a whole new thing. This looked like a suit of armor, and it had that bubble helmet that we had never seen before, and the comm cap. So many new things that we saw in the Apollo program, as evidenced by this picture of Wally in this suit-up room. And going out to the van and taking the drive out to launch pad 34, a scene that we came to know from Apollo flights thereafter coming out of that entrance. And last September, we saw the Artemis II crew come out of that same door, get into those little electric vehicles that they use now, in rehearsal for the Artemis II launch day activity.
So
So
I think this was October 18th.
yeah, this is a constant, this kind of picture from all the Apollo missions.
Absolutely.
And then the launch from pad 34, beautiful Saturn 1B rocket. You couldn't help but think about the Apollo 1 crew at this point, thinking that this is what Gus and Roger and Ed had been destined for and so tragically lost. This was also one of the things that led to some of the disagreement between Wally and the ground during the mission. Now, on launch day, you have, among other things, you have wind constraints, allowable winds. And the winds had gone above the red line, and the management wrote a waiver off on them and accepted them. Wally was angry about that because if you'd had to trigger that launch abort system and pull the capsule away from the booster, parachutes would deploy, but those strong winds would bring you back to the ground and you would hit the ground. Now, the couches on the Apollo spacecraft had basically one stroke. They would compress one time, and after that, they wouldn't compress again. Now, of course, that capsule is going to bounce 2 or 3 times when it hits the ground, and there was really a worry about serious injury under those circumstances. So that was one of the things that started to light Wally's fuse on this
Break your back.
particularly break your neck, break your back, sure. And again, our signature picture from 2 miles away, pad 34, and just bringing back all the memories that everybody felt during that launch, the idea of the rebirth of the Apollo program. Gorgeous picture taken from Apollo 7 of Florida. And we're looking at Tampa St. Pete in the foreground, and then just beyond it, the Orlando area. And then clearly identifiable on the East Coast is Cape Canaveral and Merritt Island.
Cool there. Whoops, went backwards.
One of the pictures, one of the stills from the famous television transmissions from Apollo 7. And this was such a big deal for the general public. They really latched onto this. Now, these pictures to the young people today look very primitive, and they are rather ghostly. But this was what you had back in those days. And this was an absolutely remarkable thing to see live for the first time, see live images coming down from the spacecraft in Earth orbit. Now, Wally, being Wally, he had quite a few things set aside. The sign here is at the lovely Apollo room. Let's zoom in on it. Keep those cards and letters coming in, folks, which was a quote from the old Dean Martin show back in those days. He had another sign that said, from that lovely Apollo room high atop everything. So these television transmissions were in good humor, and they really brought the people on Earth closer and closer to the space program. Television, however, was another point of contention on this flight. I think it was the first or second day when Mission Control wanted to move up the first TV transmission, and Wally disagreed. Wally said, "We're testing a new spacecraft here, and I'm saying that television will be canceled without further discussion." So this started to set the battle lines between Wally and the ground. Of course, at the time, Wally was suffering from a severe head cold, which is doubly uncomfortable in the microgravity environment when all the fluids gravitate toward your head. So he was, some people say surly, some people ill-tempered. Glenn Lunny accused him of insubordination. I mean, there are all kinds of thoughts to this. He wasn't at his best, but to my mind, it was understandable considering everything he was responsible for. Now, many years ago, we had a page from Wally's checklist from this flight, and it was regarding an unplanned burn of the service propulsion engine. And that wasn't something you just turned a switch on. You had to do a lot of calculation, get the vehicle ready, and so forth. And there was one page of the checklist called the burn pad, which talked about your attitudes, T goes, V goes, and all the rest of that stuff. And it was all penciled in, very orderly. But at the bottom, in Wally's handwriting, was the inscription, "Idiotic mess, __." So he wasn't shy, whether public or private, about his feelings about some of these flight plan updates during the mission.
We talked about that, Nick, on Stay Curious about the mission a week or two ago, and there were some quotes from Wally saying, "I want to talk to the technician who come up with this test, and the idiot who come up with this test."
That one really got
and,
us.
And,
Yeah,
and then Isley said, backed it up by saying, "Yeah, that so-and-so test was also a real beaut," you know.
There was a feeling too at one of the comments. I can't recall who made it, but one of the comments was, "We get the feeling that the people who come up with this new stuff are the same people who've been dropping the ball for the last 3 years."
There you go.
A definite reference to the fire.
Yeah.
And it was understood in those circles that you never threw the fire in anybody else's face.
Wow.
It was something that we all screwed up with. It was everybody's responsibility. So that comment in particular, I think, was very poorly received, understandably, in Mission Control.
Well, the guys had colds. They were under tremendous pressure to put America's spaceship to the moon, working great. I couldn't believe it was a 10-day mission, Nick. You'd think it'd be three or 4 days,
No,
but they really gave them the works on it.
As Walt used to say, and he was very proud of this, this is, and probably always will be, the longest flight test of any manned spacecraft.
Yeah. Here's Wally, famous picture.
Gorgeous picture of Wally. I think it just tells the story of a veteran who's made this third flight, and it's been such a huge contributor to the success of the overall manned spaceflight program. And you look at this and you realize there's the concern. There is the I think a little bit of fatigue in that picture. This was taken toward the end of the flight, but this is a guy who's going to be well deserving of his upcoming retirement.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Coming out of the capsule in the ocean, Wally's the first one out, and of course the Apollo capsule was a fine spacecraft, but a terrible boat. But the fact of the matter was that this flight was heralded as a 101% success, and it was absolutely true. You had a spacecraft that performed beyond any expectations, and it was the success of this mission that gave management the courage to say, okay, Apollo 8 is going to go to the moon. We got faith in this spacecraft, and it's going to work. So again, due in no small part to the efforts of Wally, Don, and Walt, and the entire Apollo team. It was a magnificent flight, and really, really helped us on our way to the moon. Probably an unheralded flight, because after 7, everybody remembers 8, then everybody goes to 11. But 7 is what made it all possible. And and Wally is what made 7 possible.
Absolutely. And see that frogman holding that hatch there?
Yeah.
Nick, I have held my hand on that.
The
very spot, because this
spacecraft.
is at the Frontiers of Flight Museum. We talked about it on Stay Curious a while back. And they have you walk up to the hatch. The hatch, of course, has plastic on, so you can't get in it. And I look at the docent and I go, I can touch the hatch? He goes, oh yeah, you can touch the whole spaceship. I think it's the only one you can touch.
A funny story about that hatch. It was a very, very heavy hatch. And in order to open it, there was a green nitrogen bottle just below the sill of the hatch. And you pulled the D-ring on that, and that pressurized the hatch mechanism to help you open that hatch and to keep it open. Now, there was an astronaut during Apollo. I won't mention his name
On camera.
but he took particular pride in his physicality and his muscles, and so they did an emergency egress exercise out of the pad. And what the guys, he was responsible for opening the hatch. Well, what the guys did was they disconnected the nitrogen bottle, and he pulled it, and it didn't do anything. He's trying to open up the hatch. A little trouble there, Malcolm, whatever.
Oh,
So,
really? Interesting.
yeah,
That's
it's a
great.
little green bottle. You'll see it just below the sill of the hatch, just below where Wally's hand is, I think.
Interesting. Frontiers of Flight is in Dallas Love Field, Texas.
Right.
A must bucket list, I think, for a lot of people there. It's really cool to see. And it's there because Walt Cunningham's wife was friends with the governor of Texas or something, or somebody in there. So it was up in, I think, Montreal, Canada for a while.
Yeah.
Apollo 7 there. Love our spaceships.
There's a crew on board the Essex after a successful flight. And you'll remember that was back in the days when the guys came back with heavy beards because we didn't have the ability to, the crew didn't have the ability to shave up on orbit. That changed later on. Let me see. Apollo 10, I think, might have been the first time they had the ability to shave up on orbit. On Apollo 8, you remember the crew came off the helicopter, and Lovell had a beard, and Anders had a beard, but Borman was clean shaven. And that was because he knew that the beard he grew was usually kind of stringy and peach fuzz kind of thing. So he arranged to have an electric razor waiting for him on the helicopter, and he shaved before they came out of the helicopter. But yeah, this was back in the day when after a long flight, you brought a beard back with you, and that's especially salient for Navy personnel.
Part of that, Nick, was you didn't want the whiskers getting
want them
behind
flowing
in
around.
things,
Yeah,
so you
you
didn't
don't
have a
want them
way they
flighting
were worried
around.
about it. Yeah.
Floating around inside the capsule.
All right. There's another.
And here we
great
are
shot
back at the
of it.
Cape. They've just come back from the Essex on board that transport aircraft you see behind them. This is the skid strip over here, Cape Canaveral. And again, obvious joy and happiness, and I think a lot of pride about coming back from a mission that put the American manned space program back on track and indeed put us back on the road to the moon.
Absolutely, one of the most underrated missions. Brave, worked up there.
Yep.
One thing I liked at this, when I saw this exhibit in Love Field at the Frontiers of Flight, Nick, is they had every day they had 10 boards, and it had every day's activities, what each man ate that day, the things that they checked off. It was a good visual thing to see how busy these guys were for 10 days. Wow, and a maiden flight.
And one of the things after the flight, which you did a series of debriefings, and you would discuss the guidance navigation system, safety systems, everything on board the vehicle. And one of the systems came under the heading of crew support. And one of those systems under crew support was going to the bathroom. Now, back in those days on Apollo, you had the bag that you would attach yourself up to, void into the bag, and then vent the bag's contents overboard. No big deal. For solid waste, you had to use a plastic bag that was taped to your backside, and it was a very cumbersome and very unpleasant kind of a thing to do, especially in that tight command module. So when they're divvying up who's going to write the after-action reports about these systems, Walt, you've got the waste management system. So Cunningham proceeded to write a 14-page memo describing every step in this process from start to finish. And it's all done seriously, deadpan serious, but if you read it, it's the funniest damn thing you can imagine.
Where would you find that?
Oh gosh, again,
Cunningham told you this too, I imagine that.
It might be on the website, the Apollo Flight Journal, I think it is. Again, let me dig up that website and send it to you.
It's out there somewhere.
He started out by saying, first of all, give yourself 45 minutes. to do this.
All right.
He said, secondly, if you can do both at the same time, go ahead and do both. He said, third, you're going to be stripping down right down to your bare bottom to get this done because clothing's just going to get in the way and make it more complicated. So, yeah, he came out with all these helpful hints on how to use the Apollo emesis bag and the overboard liquid waste system.
Pretty much what some of the shuttle astronauts say, Marty, about using the shuttle toilet was what's going to take 5 or 10 minutes. You better give you a half hour to an hour.
And there are a number of unprinted and unmentionable stories about that.
That's right.
Yeah.
All kinds up there. Well, here's some pretty pictures that you throw in of the great Wally, and I've added a few to round out this wonderful look at this hero of our generation.
One of the post-flight debriefs there, well, Wally shaking hands with Dr. von Braun. Dr. von Braun is absolutely charged because here's his Saturn 1B, it's worked, and this is just more indication that Saturn V is going to be successful. Just below, you can see Deke Slayton with that familiar haircut, and just in front of Wernher von Braun, just at his arm, is a NASA official named Kenny Kleinknecht.
Oh, okay.
He was one of the officials of the Apollo program. This is a time that the NASA bureaucracy started to expand, and it had to because Apollo was such a big program. But at the time, we had I'm trying to remember, George Lowe was part of the team, but more importantly was Dr. Miller. It was spelled Muller, but he pronounced it Miller. And he was the one who really brought together this whole bureaucracy and focused it very, very well. And it was getting larger, but it was still laser focused and properly executed. George Miller.
George Miller, yeah. He was on Capitol Hill all the time up there, and him with
bet.
Mr. Jim Webb.
You bet.
Moon map in the background, love that.
Yeah. And here's Wally and Gordo in later years. This is out at our visitors complex. You can see the old stack that we had of the external tank and solid rocket boosters. This was for the induction of astronauts into the Hall of Fame. As I recall, Sally Ride was at this particular event because that's where I got to meet her. But I can't recall who was being inducted at this particular event. But if you look closely there, you can see Wally is not wearing a tie. Gordo isn't wearing a tie either. I think the last time these guys wore ties was back in the 1960s. After that, it was all open collars and relaxation. But you can see Wally and Gordo are wearing their medals as members of the Astronaut Hall of Fame. This is Wally with one of our favorite nurses, Dee O'Hara. And I don't know where this was taken, but Wally by that time was wearing his standard uniform of a Hawaiian shirt.
Yeah.
Sometimes you throw a sport coat over it. But this is about the time that I met Wally and got to spend some time with him. And just a remarkable guy. I mean, the smile says it all. I guess I was privileged to be able to call him by his nickname, Sky Ray. And he was just everything you'd imagine of the fun-loving Navy test pilot. Was always ready for liberty. But yeah, just a remarkable guy and just a lot of fun to be with and spend time with.
Nickname Sky Ray.
Yeah.
What's behind that?
That was one of the planes he test flew, Sky Ray, Navy aircraft. But Sky Ray, as you can see by this picture, Sky Ray is just so apropos for him.
Yeah.
And that would be the way I'd greet him, see him across the room. Hey, Sky Ray!
Tell us about Dee O'Hara, though. No, she's still, I think, 88 years old.
Dee O'Hara, of course, the nurse during the Mercury program, and so integral to that program, taking care of the astronauts, and particularly if they had a medical need, she could either steer them to Bill Douglas, who was our flight surgeon back in the Mercury program, or perhaps somewhere where they could get a diagnosis and treatment without having to worry about jeopardizing their flight status. So she was very close to the guys, and everybody, all the guys loved her. She was one of the guys, for lack of a better description. But you'll see her in all these pictures at all phases of the mission: pre-launch, the launch, the post-flight debriefs, and so on. So she was an very integral part of the team, and someone that we admire and very much honor.
Absolutely. And one of the hidden figures of this whole
Yeah.
going to the moon, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo program for sure.
Dee, of course, had one of the great stories. After Alan Shepard's mishap on the pad, having to urinate in his spacesuit, they decided they needed a urination device for the cruise. So they came up with a method. The collection bag was attached to your leg under the suit, and the hose led to your private parts, and it was joined to your private parts by a roll-on piece of rubber, a condom, if you will.
Yes.
Now, the condoms came in 3 sizes, small, medium, and large. Well, no self-respecting test pilot is going to ask for anything less than a large. And subsequently, a lot of guys, shall we say, popped out of their equipment at the wrong time. So Dee had the right idea. She changed the nomenclature from small, medium, and large to huge, giant, and enormous.
It's okay. Well, she's quite a character. Many of you have met her at some of the book signings, things like that. She's never written a book. She co-authored one back in the 60s, but she's sworn that she's keeping all these secrets to her grave, and we hope to maybe get her run with a shuttle fest or something when we get her there. It'd be a great venue there. Well, Nick, we've enjoyed this with you. I threw in some extras here. We wanted to just mention Wally Schirra's Space is a good book to read in 1988. He talks about his parents. His dad was a World War II aviator.
World War
World War I aviator who was a barnstormer, and his mom was a wing walker.
Yeah.
And those of you who don't know what a wing walker is, here's what that is. And researching a picture of a wing walker, there's still modern day wing walkers at some of these air shows.
This is how it was done in the day.
That's his parents there.
Exciting time of the 1920s when aviation was so new.
Yeah.
And you know, we talk to astronauts and you say, what was it like to look at the Earth from 250 miles up? Well, hell, back in these days, we were saying, what was it like to look at the Earth from 1,000 feet high?
Yeah.
You know, that was remarkable.
Nobody could see. I could see the whole lake from way up above up there.
Absolutely.
This is a Paul Calley sketch of Wally during Apollo 7. Of course, Chris Calley, his son, is a friend of our museum, and always unique to see people's artwork there. A quick sketch of the suit room.
It's all part of the NASA art program that brought forward some beautiful pictures by Paul Calley and by several others.
That's right. That's right. One of the most classic images of the Apollo era there.
Yeah, again, there he is. He's ready to go. You know, point me to the spacecraft, get me inside, and let's go. But at the same time, very serious and focused engineering test pilot. Just a remarkable man.
We celebrate our astronauts, Mercury, Gemini, and some Apollo out there at the Space View Park. They keep it clean out there. That's why I put this picture there. Around the icon of Mercury there with the 7 are handprints of the Mercury 7 astronauts, except for Gus. This was done in 1999. There's Wally's out there. The first time I saw Deke Slayton's, he's got a ring finger missing. I couldn't believe it. That's where I learned that. And then you read up on it, and then you see a lot of pictures of Deke Slayton with that left hand in his pocket. All right. But there's Wally's handprints taken out there, and you mentioned a Hasselblad camera that he used. I love this picture. There's one on the table.
Yeah, Wally and Deke standing over him. They're going over the use of that Hasselblad camera. I had the honor one time when I was taking pictures of guests and astronauts that people would hand me their iPhone or their camera. So one person handed me a Hasselblad.
Oh, really?
Scared the daylights out of me. I just wanted to take the picture and get rid of it because I was so afraid of dropping it.
Yeah, they're a few $1,000s.
Yeah, more than a few $1,000s. Such an intricate piece of hardware. But after I got it out of my hands, I said to myself, damn, that was cool. I used a Hasselblad.
Yeah. And there is Wally's October 3rd mission of this Mercury flight out there at our beautiful Space View Park. We have pavers on all of the Gemini and Mercury missions out there. And just thought to throw in the Gemini mission there of Wally's.
Wally and Tom.
Which was a course of Gemini 7. 6 was to be launched.
Yeah.
You could tell the story there, but I
Yes.
wanted to throw that in there not to
Yeah.
forget them.
Yeah, 7 was launched first, and 6, after a myriad of problems, finally got off the pad and rendezvoused with 7. And of course, you see by the signatures that was Wally and Tom's launch.
In a quick half a day rendezvous and get back down.
And
to show
Wally,
that this sports car of a spacecraft.
Wally loved that. I
Yeah.
mean, it was get up there, do the rendezvous, play Jingle Bells on the harmonica,
Yeah.
and come back home.
Yeah, we'll tell the Jingle Bell story there. I want you to tell the story about this man, Gunter Vendt.
Right.
But tell the Jingle Bell story that Wally.
Well,
Wally
they were up there. When they were up there, they were approaching the Christmas season in December. And after the rendezvous was squared away and they're getting ready for re-entry, they reported to the ground seeing an object at a certain azimuth and so forth. So he's traveling a south to north trajectory. Stand by, we're going to try to signal it. And then all of a sudden, Wally's on this little Hohner harmonica that he had made special. It was about this big.
Yeah, an inch
And
and a half.
Tom Stafford was on the set of Jingle Bells, and they played Jingle Bells. So Santa Claus was coming to town. So
Yeah.
we have a replica of that Hohner harmonica in our Astronaut Hall of Fame over the visitors.
They
Column.
do.
I think
Absolutely.
the original one is at the Smithsonian.
Huh. With the great Tom Stafford, who's
Yeah.
only 92 years old, I
God bless
believe.
him. General Stafford.
Yes, absolutely right. So tell us a little bit about Gunter Vendt and his star-crossed moment in history from the end of the Gemini program to Apollo.
Well, Gunther was our pad leader starting back in Mercury, and I had the pleasure of spending a lot of time with Gunther and interviewing him for what was our newspaper back at the Visitors Complex many years ago. But he talked about going out on his boat in the Indian River at night, just sitting out in the middle of the river and playing what he called the what if game. What if this happens? How do we respond to it? What if there's a problem on the pad? So forth and so on. And again, like I say, the book was being written in real time by people like Gunther and Chris Kraft. One of the days I was over at Gunther's house for the interview, we came out to the driveway when I'm going back out to my car, and we're chatting a little bit. And I said, would you do me a favor? I said, would you open my car door? Yeah. He opened up the door for me. And then I got in the car, sat down, and I said, would you close the door for me? Yeah, he closed the door for me. I said, now I can go to my grave saying that Gunther put me in my vehicle.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Story I'm alluding to is why he ended up being the Apollo pad leader.
North American hired
Oh,
Gunther
wonderful.
after the fire at Wally's insistence and a number of the astronauts in the office and their insistence, because a lot of people felt that if Gunther had been on the pad that day, the fire wouldn't have happened. Well, that's hindsight, and Gunther himself said there's no way of telling one way or the other.
Yeah.
But everyone admired Gunther's efficiency, his focus, and also for the fact that aside from a few gag gifts and so forth, he put up with very little nonsense up there in that white room. He had everything under control, and he had been known to throw congressmen out of that white room when they were up on visits. He didn't have any business there. They were doing a test, and he was the pad leader, and that was it. He had quite a few run-ins with our old friend during Mercury. Not
O'Malley?
TJ O'Malley. He and TJ O'Malley did not get along.
Yeah.
And Gunther, when we talked about it, Gunther always talked about TJ O'Malley as being his nemesis.
They were.
Yeah.
I've heard some stories from
There was
space
a
workers
big
about
fight as
those
to
two.
who should have ultimate control out there, either the blockhouse leader or the pad
Yeah.
leader.
Test conductor was
Yeah,
TJ O'Malley.
and TJ was trying to incur on Gunther's territory, if you will. And that may sound petty, but it's very important to know the lines of responsibility and how they're delineated in this program. You can't scratch your head over who to listen to. You've got to know right from the get-go.
Good point there. And Wally was absolutely instrumental in getting Gunter as the pad leader, as a good luck's rabbit foot type of thing. It's just,
Well, they got along so well. They both
Yeah.
had a similar sense of humor. And I can remember some great stories from Gunther about Wally and the original 7 guys.
well, one of my I'll always remember as a teenager the moon landing and Walter Cronkite
Yeah.
and his sidekick was Wally Schirra. Many of us knew Wally as the commentator.
Probably the last
Beside it.
time Wally wore a necktie.
Yeah, exactly. Wiped away a tear in his eye
I can
when he
remember
when
that on
there.
Apollo
Just,
11, and it was
I've never heard anybody ask, what was he thinking? Was he thinking of his fallen mates? Was he thinking of, he could have been a moonwalker. There's no doubt about it. Do you think?
I think to his mind, he was getting a little old for this business. But then here you have Alan Shepard
Yeah.
come along, commanding Apollo 14. But I think Wally, understandably, he had other things on his mind, and there was going to be time to, get on with life and move in new directions, which Wally did, and spent a lot of time also with Joe and his family.
That's right.
So I think, you call it the way you see it, and I think that's exactly what Wally did.
Yeah, the Apollo astronaut corps is a lot of what ifs and who could have done what,
Sure.
and you end up having 5 rookies go to the moon. When a lot of good people just had enough, like a Frank Borman.
It is a very tough business.
Yeah.
And people think it's all trips to the White House and ticker tape parades. No, it's not. There is so much hard work that's done here. And you speak to the shuttle astronauts who've made 4 and 5 flights and so forth. And it wears you down. It's a grind. You really got to stay on top of everything. And you've got people like Jerry Ross and Franklin Chang Diaz who've made 7 flights. Then on the other hand, you have our friend Fred Gregory, who, if he had his wherewithal, he would launch, do 1 orbit, and come back home. That would be Fred's style.
Yeah. Well, Fred wouldn't talk about the universe like he does. He spent all that time up there. I love
that's
how
the
Fred
thing. I think
gets this way out there.
Fred has more of a poetic soul than he gives himself credit for.
That's what's surprising astronauts to me was Fred
Yeah.
Gregory. Yeah, he's a very poetic
No,
man.
he's very, very expressive, and
He
he
is.
really brings the experience to
Let's
life.
put the wrap on Wally Schirra here with a
Yeah.
couple great pictures late in his life there. There he is with
Let's see. Okay, this
Mr.
is
Jim Lovell,
this will-
93.
I see by the label up top side. This is in the operations checkout. And pardon me, this is in one of the OPF bays, orbital processing facility. And there's Wally with Captain Jim
They must have had
sitting
it.
at the hatch of Endeavour.
That's right. And one final picture here with 3 of our heroes.
Man, yeah, what can you say about a picture like this? I mean, 3 of the men who were there at the beginning saw so much progress made, expended great effort. You could do a whole show about any of these 3 guys. I had the pleasure of all their acquaintances at one time or another. They were all sterling gentlemen, highly professional, and I don't mean to pun here, but down to earth. These were guys who were not full of themselves, who were not ego-driven, who realized totally the privileged position they'd been put in and were very appreciative of it.
Well, today, Dick Thomas, we got Bill Whiting's watching and Doug Forrest, Carlton Bailey's on there, Hey CB, Tommy UCX in Pennsylvania, Cynthia Rossi. She'll be out there getting you an autograph for the girls out there this weekend, I'm sure, this week. Dave Stangy's in Germany, Marty's noted here. Gary Gerald's our Vidalia onion farmer up there in Georgia. Robert Law, hope everything's probably turning pretty brisk up there in Dundee, Scotland. Tom Celentano, love you watching. And my buddy Cliff Watson is in Simona, Australia. He is enjoying springtime down there in Australia. So we've talked about these guys have the right stuff.
Just a few quick words out to some friends of mine.
Yeah.
Mary Beth Ellis, our friend from the Canadian Space Agency, Bob Thirsk, Wendy Lawrence, Valerie Egan, all the people out there that I'm privileged to be associated with and who I hope will enjoy this presentation.
Absolutely. We certainly do. Love to have Bob Thirsk here. Mr. Thirsk, you were very, very good speaker out there. The way he talked about the medical stuff that, that you hadn't heard.
Incredible insight into that.
We'd love to have Wendy on here. Of course, I'm going to ask her about the Mir Space Station stuff all the time because she was there twice. That mess she said that they've had up there. Marty, you want me to remind everybody that these were our space heroes and they had the right stuff, to ask Mr. Nick Thomas about the right stuff, the movie, the book?
Well, back in the 1980s, I was in New York City trying to break into show business and had been to several auditions, and then came to learn at one point that The Right Stuff was going to be made into a film. Now, the casting was going to be by a company, Wally Schirra and Associates. So I said, how can I get my face in front of these people? Because I didn't have a SAG card, I didn't have an agent. So the next day, I was in Times Square in a Army-Navy store, and hanging from the roof, they had a Mark VI Navy pressure suit with a helmet. I said, that's it. So I laid out the money for that. I went home and I called a friend of mine who was a photographer in Daytona Beach. And I said, be at KSC at the Visitors Complex next Wednesday. We're going to take some pictures. So I stood by some of the exhibits there in the suit with helmet on, helmet off, things like that. And I figured these would kind of set me apart from everyone who wanted a role in that picture. So we took the pictures, got them developed, and I sent them off to Wally Schirra's office. And about a week or two later, she sent them back saying the casting was now being handled by Lynn Stallmaster. Now, if you've ever watched a motion picture from the 1950s through the 1970s and 80s, Lynn Stallmaster's name as a casting director has been on all the big ones. He was an incredible force, just absolutely a well-known casting director in the business. So, having gotten pictures back, I sent them to Lynn, telling them that I wanted to audition for the picture. Well, I tried several weeks to get some kind of word, and there was no kind of word, nothing from Lynn's office, no messages on my service. So one morning, I was in the city, and I called Lynn's office on Pico Boulevard in Los Angeles from a payphone, and I said, look, I really got to know something. You guys gonna come? Are you guys gonna see my work or not? And the girl said, have you checked your service yet? I said, no. She said, well, there's a message on your service. Lynn wants to see you Thursday over at so-and-so on Avenue of the Americas, I think it was. I can't remember. So that day I showed up, went upstairs, and we talked. And Lynn asked me, he said, would you be interested in the role of Gus Grissom? I said, well, Gus is my favorite astronaut. I said, but I'm too tall for Gus. He said, what about Gordon Cooper? I said, yeah. I said, I've met Gordon Cooper back in Daytona, back in 72. Yeah, I'd like to read for that. So I read all the scenes on camera. And when we finished, the producer of the film, Erwin Winkler, came into the room. And he said, Nick, do you mind watching your own work? I said, no. So we sat down, we watched the playback of the screen test. And when it was all over, he asked me, he said, could you lose some weight? I said, yeah, I can do that. And he says, okay, we'll be in touch. So several weeks went by, and I think it was a month and a half, 2 months later, and I called Lynn's office in Los Angeles. I said, have you cast the role yet? And he said, yeah, we've cast it. I said, well, who got it? He said, well, I can't tell you. I'm not allowed to say that until we make the announcement. And I said, I really appreciate the shot. You know, I don't have a SAG card. I don't have an agent, but you gave me a shot at this, and I really appreciate it. And he says, I don't know if I should tell you this because I don't know how you're going to take it. I said, go ahead, tell me. And he said, you're among the last 5 people we cut. I said, well, that's good to know. And at some point here in the near future, I'll go ahead and I'll send you those pictures of the run-up that I did. I even took a picture in my father's Corvette wearing an Air Force flight suit just to give that right amount of pizzazz to it. So it was a great adventure. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. And being considered by Lynn Stallmaster for a role in a motion picture is no small
to play
thing.
Gordon Cooper.
Pretty good.
At that, too. That is awesome. Great story to end our Stay Curious here.
Who got the shot?
Oh, that was, what's his name? The 2 brothers. Oh, gosh, you had to ask me, didn't you?
Yeah, who...
oh, gosh.
Yeah, who
No,
did get to
I
play
can't
that?
remember
Not the...
Yeah, we're just talking about it. He was married to Meg Ryan, and he had a brother who was also an actor. Quaid. Dennis Quaid got it.
Quaid.
So
Quaid.
my friends and I joked about this for a long time, And my friend said, "Hey, boy, if you'd gotten that role, you would have had Dennis Quaid's life. You would have been married to Meg Ryan. You would have been a big movie star." And I said, "Yeah, and I'd have been an alcoholic and had a cocaine problem. So
Yeah,
no,
right.
thank you."
No, don't need that.
Yeah.
Well, Nick, you're a fascinating person. I love hearing about people's when we our misspent youth sort of way is the way I look at it.
Well,
Not misspent my way, but you were willing to take some chances that other people weren't, and I like that about
it
you.
changes directions, and you don't know at the time that it's going to be a beneficial change, but in looking back, it is. And sure, I didn't get the thing in New York, but it prepared me for what I do now. And nobody lives a happier.
Absolutely. Like you say, you've not worked a day at Kennedy Space Center since you've been there.
I haven't
you?
worked a day in 37 years.
Well, we're glad that you're part
Don't
of.
tell my boss that.
I won't. No, unless they watch this, okay, on there. But thank you, Nick. We enjoy you always here. Fascinating story, and we love your personal stories on there. And we'll have him back in November to talk about some aspect of November. We got Apollo 12 on the moon. We got a couple Gemini flights, I think, and we love talking about that. And I think there's over 12 shuttles in the month of November. So, Nick, thank you for participating in our Stay Curious program.
Thank you, Pat.
Marty, good job over there. Anything we need to button up?
No, we're caught up, but you had a lot of comments, Nick, as far as what a great show it was and people enjoying your stories. So you can read the comments later.
Well, I'm glad people are tuning in. It's a worthwhile place, the American Space Museum. And not only tune into these podcasts, but come out here and see us and show the love.
Thank you very much, Nick. We love everybody that supports us in so many ways. This week, we're going to talk about the shuttles of the month of October, wrap that up. Wednesday, we got Mikey Haddad, level 4 engineer out there working on shuttle payloads. We're going to talk about the German payload, D1.
Oh, yeah.
On there. They did 2 German. I think they had a record 8 astronauts on that mission up there. So we got Mikey Haddad on Wednesday and just all kinds of space news and a potpourri of space activities going here at the coast we'll be sharing with you on Stay Curious. So until then, I'm Mark Marquette saying we can't wait to see you in our museum to bridge the space between us. See you soon.